Central bankers at the European Central Bank are getting very worried. Now, if you don't remember, back in December of 2020, the European Central Bank, or ECB, announced an additional new bond buying program for European Union government bonds. And prior to 2021, they announced that they were going to buy an enormous amount of all European Union government bonds that were going to be issued in 2021. Over 75%. I think the actual numbers over 80% to be exact. And the European Central Bank's balance sheet is already the largest in the entire world in terms of assets, and I'm using air quotes, aka toxic garbage and bonds, at 8.6 trillion, as you can see there on your screen. Although in terms of a percentage of GDP, it is still far behind Japan, the Bank of Japan. So the Federal Reserve Bank has a lot of catching up to do to both the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan, and that is Japanification. Buying government bonds, subsidizing the size of big government or growing the size of government, and allowing government to continue to issue more bonds that the central bank buys the majority of. So the European Central Bank's balance sheet is already over 60% of nominal GDP in the European Union, and that is assuming that the inflation rates are true that are being given out by politicians and bureaucrats and PhD economists and central bankers. So over 60% of GDP for the European Central Bank balance sheet is enormous, but things are far from over, unfortunately. Now, yields are starting to rise on European Union government bonds as the European Central Bank's bond buying program that already increased a few months ago, after it already increased earlier in 2020. So there was 2 increases actually in 2020. They're now talking about additional bond buying programs. I have a number of articles for you to take a look at. There's now been 2 calls for additional bond buying programs just in the last couple weeks by European Central Bank central banksters. The European Central Bank may have over 70% of the European Union's nominal GDP equivalent on their balance sheet of toxic bonds in the not too distant future, as soon as a year or 2. That is how crazy things are getting. And unfortunately, this is a vicious cycle. This is Japanification. This is stagflate tax light. It is a vicious cycle of more currency unit to buy government bonds of all levels of government, especially here in the US, but subsidizing the size of government to maintain the size of government, or allow the government to grow, or give the cronies, so cronies in government or connected to government and large corporations and special interest groups, access to unbidded contracts. So this is more and more fascism or socialism, more totalitarian government, less bottom-up chances for people to move up, small business owners, entrepreneurship, people to actually create new products and services and become rich. This is the vicious cycle here of more currency unit to buy bonds. This is a perfect example besides what has happened in Japan, and Japan is a unique case study the last 30 or 40 years. But now you have all these major central banks, whether that is the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, all trying to do similar policy objectives. And the Fed's balance sheet is headed to European Central Bank levels in terms of a percentage of GDP. So I could easily see the Fed's balance sheet massively increasing in the next couple years as a percentage of GDP. So the size of the Fed's balance sheet in terms of trillions more added, subsidizing these enormous budget deficits, subsidizing these additional spending programs, subsidizing God knows what else. That is off balance sheet in a special purpose vehicle and probably not going to be counted on the actual on balance sheet items, while the U.S. Treasury General Account is trained to slow down the Fed's balance sheet growth temporarily. But the European Central Bank is in trouble. They are trying to maintain the size of all these European Union governments, and that is distorting things. It is creating really, really bad behavior on behalf of politicians, bureaucrats, central bankers, and it is subsidizing big government, a welfare state, and preventing the economy from actually repairing itself, from fixing itself. And this is why the whole thing is a Ponzi scheme, because currency units are created out of thin air to buy bonds. And that is how this debt Ponzi scheme keeps growing and growing and growing. In the last 12 months, 24 trillion in debt was added according to the International Institute of Finance. And the European Union was responsible for an enormous amount of it if you take a look at the parabolic move of the European Central Bank balance sheet.